Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought. All right, so today I want to talk a little bit about free trade and the risks that it entails. So I've been mulling this over in my head for probably a month, but seems like a really opportune time to talk about it. So I want to kind of frame this properly because I think there's some opportunities with people kind of starting to doubt maybe a little more of a liberal worldview. And so just to talk through some of this in terms that a lot of liberal people might have experience with and might be more familiar with. So in economics, we have this concept of specialization, and it's very commonly discussed in classes. It's kind of a bedrock principle. You get this idea that specialization leads to our ability to increase our wealth by trading with each other, right? And so the standard model is that, one person can make 5 bananas and 6 apples, and then the other person can make 3 bananas and 9 apples in an hour. And so they benefit. You basically do the math and you figure out, well, if one person specializes in their competitive advantage, or their comparative advantage, and the other specializes in their comparative advantage, even if one person is better at everything than the other, then it actually still makes sense for them to specialize and for them to then trade. And what happens is they both end up with more of the good. And so this is something you learn very early on in an economics course. It's at the beginning of every textbook, in every undergraduate, basic econ textbook. It's the beginning of every kind of course on economics you would see online or whatever. And so this is just the way people often think, right? So what happens is, even if we get more complicated models or more complicated circumstances, we're always, I think, as economists, economists are always kind of still thinking in terms of the basics. We like simple models in the sense that they're parsimonious and they're mathematically elegant and they make few assumptions and stuff like this. And so that tends, I think, to make economists and those who are educated by economists sort of prone to fall back on these basic models of reality. And my biggest problem with this is that it doesn't take into account any kind of risk, right? You'll notice that example, where just, one person makes this many of each thing and this other person makes a different amount of each thing. And so they should just trade, right? So you notice that that's very static, right? It's like the two, the amounts that they can make never change, and there's never any risk that one of their trading partners will be gone. So there's no risk built in. There's no uncertainty built into this at all. And a couple weeks ago, when I did the episode on it was really an episode on Taleb, honestly, and kind of his way of thinking about uncertainty and the Chinese coronavirus. I talked about risk and uncertainty in some of these issues, and I just want to kind of put it in context with this trade thing. So I'm very interested in risk. It's something I've studied a lot as a professional economist. It's something that I'm always thinking about, and it always shocks me how little we include this in kind of the basic economic education that we give to students. And I'm not really sure why, besides the fact that it's just tougher to model realistic risk than it is to just sort of generate and pass along these relatively simple models. And so anyway, there's this whole idea of specialization and trade, right? And so what happens is then when we get into a discussion of international trade, then the same concept is essentially applied more broadly to international trade, right? As complex as that is, right? Every time you have a conversation with someone about practical policy and restrictions on trade and stuff like that, they're always going to fall back on this basic specialization in trade comparative advantage story. Even though when we're talking about international trade, we're not talking about, one person and another person trading. We're talking about trade between thousands or millions of companies across international borders in an incredibly complex fashion, right? So it's certainly not the same thing. And especially these days, we have international supply chains where, a product might be in 3 or 4 countries as it's being produced. And so, the problem I have is that this, when we talk about supply chains, it's a totally different kind of story than this whole specialization in trade thing. It's just not the same kind of thing. A supply chain has risk in it. And what's interesting is that, if you look at business scholars in kind of the management field, or just, maybe even more narrowly just say, strategy or supply chain management, they will talk about risk, and they will talk about, the possibility for problems to arise. And obviously we're dealing with that right now with this coronavirus thing, right? The virus came from China, and China holds massive amount of our supply chain for many things, including, crucial parts of our medicine and stuff like that. And so now it's like all of a sudden now everybody realizes that there's this risk problem. There's this uncertainty. It's like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, this was the eventuality that certain people were concerned about. And I just saw Peter Navarro on Tucker Carlson's show this evening. This is March 18th for reference. And, the first thing Tucker says to him is, when you were appointed, Peter Navarro is a Harvard economist, I think. When you were appointed, Tucker says to him, people were, mocking you and all this stuff because you were talking about trade in a certain way. And I just got Peter Navarro's book, Death by China, I think. And I'm really pumped to read that. But it's kind of interesting where, Navarro, he was mocked. And I remember this so clearly that, the economics profession was like, oh my gosh, Trump picked Peter Navarro. And, Peter Navarro, isn't he such a rube? Isn't he such an idiot? Because he thinks that, free trade is bad, and he doesn't think free trade good like me. And it's sort of like very, kind of a sad vindication for him, but it is a vindication nonetheless, right? This whole coronavirus thing is like, yeah, I guess Peter was right. I guess, the sort of common sense of worrying about risk and worrying about uncertainty in international trade is important. And so, it's so funny because when you think about this, shifting back to the political side for a minute, when you think about this from a liberal perspective, right, you're not allowed to think of countries as entities, right? That's nationalism, and nationalism bad, right? So we're only allowed to think of individual people as entities, right? We're not allowed to think of families as entities, right? Because, of course, only individuals choose, right? I guess maybe this is more libertarian, but so maybe a more extreme version of liberalism, I suppose. But still, you definitely have this liberal mindset that, even in sort of the left liberal world and the far left, nations cannot be entities. That's bad. But the reality is that is exactly what the simple specialization and trade model assumes, is that you have these two entities. And in the sense that, we have realpolitik and we have national policy, and that's just the way it is, there are national entities, right? Maybe in the world of economic theory, nations don't make choices, blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, but their leaders do. And those choices have huge effects. And in this case, anyone who's thinking about risk is going to think about the fact that, there was always risk there, and it was just a matter of time before something happened that disrupted all of this stuff. And it could have been anything. It could have been lots of things besides a sort of viral pandemic. But it's such an interesting case. You have even people who really are just sharp people. They're sitting here saying, no, we can't close down. We can't have, we can't change our trade policy. We can't let this change us, blah, 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 all this principle stuff. When it's like, well, principles are fine, but you've just had the wrong ones. And so, this whole idea of specialization in trade happening at this national level is so interesting because, when we think about, okay, how is the risk thing going to affect this story about specialization in trade and comparative advantage? Well, when we bring it down to an individual level, right, where the theory is, starts out, right, where it's explained to you when you're starting out learning economics, it's the risk thing maybe doesn't seem so important to you because when we're talking about individuals, or when we're talking about even just like a business and maybe considering that to be an individual, we kind of understand that there is community around us to help support us when something does go wrong. And so, of course, I'm going too far with something that's just intended to teach people basic economics, but the reality is that this whole specialization in trade thing can ignore comparative advantage, can ignore risk to an extent because, at the individual level or at the business level, we have families, we have communities, we have support mechanisms. We have in more traditional societies, right? We have the incentive to sort of save some money for a rainy day. And so this whole idea of specialization in trade makes more sense because it's like, well, heck, I can increase my wealth. I can increase the amount that I'm able to get a hold of, by specializing and by sort of, participating in a market with my, comparative advantage. But the problem is that when you then extrapolate that to the national level, all of a sudden that whole idea of support systems, family, savings, and all those sorts of things, they certainly change. We could say that, individuals have support systems, they have friends, but countries have nothing but potential enemies or actual enemies, right? And I'm not an international relations scholar or anything like that. I don't know anything about that stuff, but it strikes me as quite plain that, while you might be able to trust your neighbor or your friend or your family, it's probably a bad idea for you to trust another country, another government with, the ability for their incentives to change very quickly against your favor. And so if that's the case, if we have a case like this where, we've entrusted to an extent our supply chain to this country that, the sensible people would have told you was risky from the get-go, even if they knew nothing about, specialization in trade and comparative advantage, right? Even if they knew nothing about that, they would just say, well, yeah, I guess, you think you're getting sort of blood out of a stone, but you got to be careful because, they could turn right around on you. And it's kind of funny because I just saw a video on Twitter that was back during the Obama years. There was some report that came out that said 4 out of 5 of our vaccines are, made in China, or they're partly made in China or something like that. And they've got the Health and Human Services Secretary, Kathleen Sebelius, on TV. And the TV host goes, well, what do you think about this? Like, isn't there risk here where, if China has 4/5 of our vaccines? And Sebelius is just, she doesn't know how to respond to this. She's just hemming and hawing and shaking, and she doesn't know what to say. Because it's such a fundamental, basic thought process, right? there is uncertainty here. This could go wrong. And we don't know how to fix it. There's not much you can do at that scale when you have 300 million people at the time and 350 million now in the country, and you have something as complex as a supply chain built around a country who does not have your best interest at heart, and in fact doesn't even treat you as an ally. So it's kind of, you can have all these woke platitudes all day long, but at some point the reality of the situation is going to hit you, and the world is just simply not as safe as you want it to be. And so that's kind of the next thing I want to bring up, is that when we're thinking about this dichotomy between businesses and individuals in this sense of specialization in trade and the support system they have versus countries that don't, it kind of struck me as it sounded a lot like another sort of commentary I'd heard on this before. And of all people, this came from Bryan Caplan, who is a noted libertarian economist. And he has written, and I don't know if he still does, but he has written for a very popular economics blog called EconLib, or EconLog, I guess. And he had this post one time where he was talking about the fact that a liberal worldview makes a lot of sense when the world is safe, right? When everything is safe, we can talk about banning guns. We can talk about not preparing for, bad things to happen. We can talk about, shrieking on television all day long about, every little injustice that we perceive in the world. But that all makes sense when the world is really safe, right? I can worry about, some discomfort if my basic needs are met, right? It's this sort of thing. So the liberal mindset, and he, and obviously the framing is a little different between him and me, but, for him, he was calling liberal like, almost left wing. Whereas, in his framing, he says, the conservative worldview, I would say, a traditional worldview, just because of the weirdness of these terms. A more traditional worldview understands that the world is not safe, no matter how safe you think it is, no matter how low the variation in incomes has been, no matter how long it's been, how many locks you have on your door, how long it's been since you've been attacked, how many locks are on your door, how many police are roaming around trying to make everything safe, right? There is risk there. The world is not safe. The reality of our lives is that things can go wrong at the blink of an eye. And especially in a world where no one thinks that's possible. And so you notice that more right-leaning type of people are, they make completely different policy arguments about a lot of these things, like firearms or, preparation for these types of events. So you can see that the mindset difference results in not only a difference of sort of how they approach their own lives, but also how they think policy should be different, right? So now all of a sudden, Peter Navarro makes a ton of sense, because even though he's not operating in sort of approved, elite economics opinion, it actually makes a ton of sense what he's saying. We should prepare for these types of events. We should worry about this kind of risk, supply chain risk and stuff like this. We should worry about how much of our lives is tied in with China. We should worry about how much we sort of implicitly trust them and how much we allow companies to operate with them. And you can see the extremes that these things go to. Like, with the protests from Hong Kong, we had NBA players and NBA coaches complaining because, people in the U.S. were on the side of Hong Kong and against the Chinese government. It's like, really, the NBA is so beholden to the Chinese communists that they can't even allow, they gripe when people criticize them. I remember Steve Kerr, I think. He's a coach in the NBA. And he says, that, what about the crimes of the United States? And it's like, dude, are you insane? Like, the Chinese communists have concentration camps and they just murder people for fun. You're way off the reservation, dude. So I think that makes the case here is that what's so interesting. I mean, I could say a million things. I could talk about Jonathan Haidt's stuff. I think you talk about the Tim Pool's had some interesting videos lately about this whole, all of a sudden now, when LA County is basically, they've stopped enforcing basic criminal law there. Now all of a sudden everybody in LA County, who has any kind of money is lined up in front of a gun store. And it's like, see what you did to yourself? Maybe your worldview is a little messed up. So, it's so many examples of this basic reality of risk and uncertainty, right? Risk being, sort of foreseeable problems, whereas uncertainty being unforeseeable problems or issues with, you not knowing what you don't know kind of thing. To me, this applies very easily to free trade and restrictions in trade, even if you pay for them with lower GDP per capita or less income or less efficiency or however you want to frame that. If you pay for it with, or if that's the cost, then maybe the benefit is lower risk. Maybe the benefit is fewer situations like this where you have a pandemic virus in your country. Any other kind of supply chain disruption could be the same kind of thing when you're leaning on free trade so heavily. And of course, there are side benefits, right? We wouldn't have so many people in Appalachia and in other areas of the country killing themselves to the extent that we're actually pulling down our death or our average life expectancy from deaths of despair and economic turmoil. Maybe we would have, maybe these people would have, maybe these teenagers in, rural Ohio would have their fathers, because their dad didn't just figure that, I just can't take it anymore. I don't have a job, and, my job just got outsourced, or my job just got outsourced to a robot, and I just can't handle anything anymore. They might as well have the life insurance, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that's happening to people. And it's like, you mention this to people and it's like, my GDP, well, okay, well, who gives a crap, right? I mean, it's the fundamental concept of finance, right? Risk requires a reward. If we have, higher incomes and stuff like this, well, generally speaking, the way you're going to do that is with higher risk. And this is a very clear example of that principle happening right in front of our faces. So I want to finish off by taking another jab at Taleb and this whole popularity of the kind of fat tail statistical jargon, and just kind of try to make that a little plainer. This whole idea of fat tails is like, well, you're perceiving the world as having a certain distribution of outcomes, right, with a certain risk level implied in that distribution of outcomes. And what Taleb talks about, and a lot of other people who have kind of latched onto a lot of the stuff that he's been talking about. Not that it's anything revolutionary. Again, I don't think it is. But just that it's popular. And so we have this idea of, fat tails and, you underestimated the probability of these extreme events, right? And the reality is that in most realms where this is even, something that, most of us can really even conceive of, right? This whole fat tails thing is just basically your grandma from, who's a greatest gin person. She's born in 1925. Just basically, that's what she told you, right? Her wisdom was, don't eat cookies. You can eat steak and eggs all you want, but don't eat cookies or you get fat, right? She's, work hard and save your money and you'll be okay, right? Don't worry about going to school. and going to, becoming some highfalutin person. Just live simply, right? And, from a risk standpoint, hey, don't do stupid stuff because it's a bad idea, right? Don't trust people who don't have your best interest at heart. Live near home, stay near your family. Stay around people who care about you because they're going to be dependable. Right? This is all fat tails discussions, right? This is all avoiding the fat tails. And like I said, your grandma knew that. Maybe your grandma's a boomer. Maybe you're younger than me. Your grandma was a boomer, whatever. And so maybe this wisdom didn't get carried down. But the point is that previous generations did understand this stuff very well. It was intuitive. This was intuitive to people who were sort of cut from a more, reactionary or traditional mindset. And we've lost that. Partly, many would say thanks to the boomers, sure, they certainly didn't help anything, but on this front. But I would say that it's the mindset, and maybe they brought that mindset, maybe they accelerated it or something, fine. But it's really this liberal mindset that just says, well, we can just finance that risk with greater income. It's like, well, no, that's not how human nature works. People don't actually do that, right? People don't save. Many people can't. Many people can't because of the way the liberal system works, right? And so you get, when you have a problem like this, and first of all, you may not have had the problem in the first place if you'd had borders the way they should be. And even if you did, you might be in a lot better place to take care of it if, we had communities that could, small communities that could do what they needed to do to isolate cases or, help small businesses get through this kind of problem or help, poor people and those who don't have a place to go. Not that those resources don't exist, but we're all looking to the national government, the federal government, because none of these communities have the authority to do this stuff. None of these communities have the resources to do this stuff. Because again, everything is built on trade and free trade, and everybody just specialize and do your own thing, and no one worry about the possible eventualities of how bad this stuff can get. So, again, this is a perfect case study for taking care of risk and making sure that the wisdom from the right-wing mindset is forefront in your mind when you're thinking about policy issues that promise you higher incomes and don't discuss risk. So with that, I thank you for listening. I appreciate Rolf, as always, for his monthly donations. I hope more of you would want to support the podcast financially. You can do that over on anchor.fm/TradDads. You can also, if you're listening on YouTube, swap over and listen to the audio podcast, because I do have an ad that runs on there that helps a little bit. So I do appreciate that. And also share the show if you think this is valuable content. Appreciate your time. Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.